Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. So if you've been following along, you've seen that we've rebuilt our Spitfire gearbox. This is the 1147 engine out of that same car. And when we pulled out the gearbox, we decided to pull out the engine and the transmission as a unit, partly because it's just easier that way, but also because we know that this engine has a little bit of excessive crankshaft end float. And so today we're going to show you how to fix that. Just a quick note to tell you what this video is not. I am not going to rebuild this engine right now. I'm aware that it's out of the car. Yes, it is very easy to get at all the parts, but the car's going to be going through a restoration eventually anyway, and if I'm going to do a body off restoration, the engine's going to come back out. I'd rather have it fresh at that time. So right now all we're going to take care of is the maintenance, because this is something that it's out of spec, it's easy to do, and it really should be done. We don't have to go through and spec out everything, take it to a machinist to get this kind of repair work done. So let me show you exactly what we're talking about, how to measure it, and technically you can do this while it's in the car. So some of the Triumphs, like a GT6, an early one anyway, you'll have to loosen the engine mounts and kind of jack it up a little bit, just so that you have clearance to get the oil pan off around the filter. But generally speaking, you can do this while the engine's in the car. So let me show you how to spec it to make sure that your crankshaft end float is where it should be, and if it's not, then you need to follow the procedure that we're about to do. Well, let me show you what's wrong, and we're going to do that by setting up this dial indicator, but we want it to be oriented correctly. To basically be parallel with the engine. There we go. That should be good. Okay. Now, what we're trying to do is see how far back and forth the crankshaft moves. This crank pulley obviously is bolted to the crankshaft, and so if the crankshaft is sliding back and forth, this pulley will move with it. And so you should be able to see kind of a maximum movement. So you want to move it one way and then zero your gauge. Halfway decent at math, you don't really have to zero the gauge, but anyway, we'll do it. There we are at 0, and then pushing it back the other direction. That is 11 thousandths. So, one way at 0, move it the other way, we're 11 thousandths towards the back. So, that has a play of 11 thousandths, which is actually way too much. I believe the spec is 4 to 6. I'm going to check that in a moment. You can see the needle moving there. So that's excessive play. That is a sign that we need to open up the engine. Well, at least drop the oil pan. Again, you can do this with the engine in the car. You just have to be able to get underneath it. And you can put in some new thrust washers to kind of limit the movement back and forth. I'll show you how to do that. First things first, let's get the fluids out of the engine. There's oil and then there's coolant in there. But we're going to start with the oil because the engine's been sitting a while, and so we know that that's basically all drained out in the pan. Okay, even though you've drained out the coolant from the radiator, there's still likely to be some in the engine, because the radiator is only going to drain anything at the level of the water pump and higher. Because basically where the hoses connect, which is, this is coming down from the water pump. So anything below this level isn't getting out. So there's still going to be some coolant in the block. When you turn it over, it's going to be a problem. Therefore, you want to take out this plug. There you go. With the cylinder head on it, it's a little top heavy, so if you have an engine stand like I do, just be careful, because as you're twisting it, it's going to want to suddenly drop off to one side, and sudden movements are never good. So just make sure that you don't let go of it. These little magnetic holders work great. I love this ratchet, by the way. If anybody from Milwaukee wants to sponsor my videos, that'd be great. And the mistake I always see people make is they put a metal wedge like a screwdriver underneath. These oil pans can bend pretty easily. You could scrape the surfaces pretty easily. When you go to put it back on, you want to make sure that it's flat. And you can do that by kind of pounding it against a flat surface. But to avoid scratching it, you want to use a plastic tool and use that for leverage. So you can kind of, because they always stick, let's be honest. They say, oh, don't use any sort of tool. Well, you kind of have to use something. It's just not going to come off otherwise. There we go. Sticking on something here. Imagine the oil pump. Ah. Don't forget to take the dipstick out. There we go. That's our oil pan gasket, which we're not going to reuse, but actually it's in remarkably good shape. I'm surprised that normally would come apart. Rule number 1, 2, and 3, anytime that you have the engine apart, is cleanliness. While my hands dry off, the thrust washers are underneath this rear main bearing cap. There's going to be kind of half washers on either side, moon-shaped ones. And the idea is that they're going to keep the crankshaft from sliding back and forth out of tolerance. So we need to pop off this rear main bearing cap. You can take out the half thrust washers. They kind of circle out. The bearing cap kind of keeps them in. So right now they're half moon shaped this direction, not this side. They're underneath the crankshaft. But after you take the bearing cap off, you can push down on one side and rotate it around the crankshaft. I'll show you that. Then you can measure how thick those are. We know that it's moving back and forth by 11 thousandths, which is too much. You subtract the spec, and that's how thick you want your washers to be, or how much thicker, rather, you want your washers to be than what's in there currently. Okay, now we need to get the rear bearing cap off. And remember, we're going to re-torque this when we're done, but getting it off doesn't really matter. Except that my tool runs out of battery instantly. Feel it moving here. And if you're going to wedge it, use a plastic tool. It's going to be safer for the engine. There we go. There we go. Take a look at the bearing while you're in there. Oh. Try and maintain the cleanliness standard. Take a look at the bearing while you're in there. Make sure that there's no scouring that you don't want to see. Hopefully that's just dirt. Yes, it is. Keep it in the same orientation. You want it to go back the same way. I don't actually know if that's necessary on this engine, but it's something that's just a good practice to be in. And then the thrust washers are in here. And you can see what I did. I just sort of pushed down on one end so that I could grab it from the other. Well, maybe I go this way. Maybe given that you were going to replace these anyway, it's probably not the end of the world to grab at it with a pair of pliers. Just be careful that you're only touching the thrust washer and that you don't damage the crank journal. There we go. And that's what you're looking at. Of course, the crankshaft's pressed back against it, so if you want a little more room, press the crank the other way. Now it should come out easier. Okay, there we go. I can actually see that this rear one is worn down pretty badly. Now make sure when you take these out that you pay attention to these grooves. That lets oil in. You want to put that back in the same way, or actually better yet, check your shop manual. You want to see which way it is. The grooves in this were pointed towards the back, and that's because it goes against the back end of the crankshaft. It should be the other way around in the front side, but I could already tell that this rear one is basically toast. So now we're at 11 thousandths. The spec, by the way, I just checked it. It's between 4 and 8 thousandths. So the thrust washers that we put in, we want to make sure that the crank then has an end float of between 4 and 8, preferably closer to 4, because then that'll give it a chance to wear, and when we go to check it later, hopefully it'll still be less than 8. Alright, now when you measure the thrust washers, you just kind of want to eyeball it. I'm kidding, don't use that. Clean off your bearing. And then you want to measure the thickness using that. So this is 91 thousandths. Check it in a few spots. It's 90. 92. Almost seems like it was wearing lopsided. That's not good. That's 93. 93. This one's better. 93. Okay. So we're going to replace them both anyway, but 93 and let's call it 91, because that was the thinnest measurement. Let's check our new ones. Standard is 92, 91, 91, okay. 91, 93. Okay, so if we put in these standard ones, we're going to get exactly the same size we did before and the same amount of end floats. I've also bought a set that were 5 thousandths over. You can mix and match these, so if we drop it by 5 thousandths, that would put us at 7 thousandths basically over, which is within our spec of 4 to 8. If we put in both of the 5 thousandths over, then that's going to be too much. That'd be what, 2 thousandths then that we'd have left. So we don't want to do that because that is a little bit too tight. So we could put in one of these, and then we'll put in one of the standard and one of the 5 over. And before we do that, we're just going to double check that the 5 over is actually 5 over. It says so on the back, but that's no reason to believe it. Yeah, we're at 99. Okay. 98 and a half. 98. 98, okay. So one of these and one of these. Let's get these in the engine. When you put these back, first of all, lubricate them with assembly lube. You can use oil if you're just doing a quick job like this, but assembly lube I like because it's a little stickier, it works better. There's a groove in the bearing, and that groove goes against the crankshaft. So on the front one, it will be facing that way. On the rear one, it'll be facing towards the back of the engine. That's the bearing surface. So once you have that set,
You just kind of want to slide it into place, and just like the old ones came out, actually we set the crankshaft forward first, didn't we? So, okay, same thing. Let's do the rear one first then. Get one in place and then push the crank in the other direction to give you the clearance that you need. There we go. It doesn't really matter which one's in which place, just so long as you get the right tolerance at the end. Lube the crankshaft and the bearing as it goes in. Again, there's no oil on here. There was when you took it off, so best thing to do is to put a lubricant back on that'll stick pretty well. The last thing that you want to do is starve your engine of oil. You're just going to take it all apart right away again. Okay. Once that's done, get your bearing cap. Pay attention to what you're doing too. There's a very small gap. You should be able to see it, but there's a small gap between the crankshaft and the bearing cap and the rear of the block. And so this will only fit one way. If you fit it the wrong way, it's going to be rubbing up against the crank. At least in this engine, it may be machined differently in yours, but just like I said, make sure that it goes back the same way that it came off. That's important. And the other thing is, if you don't get it right, then the thrust washer is going to come out anyway, so you don't want that either. We're going to get a torque wrench on this. Make sure you refer to the shop manual for the appropriate torque. For this particular engine is 50 foot-pounds, but I know that it's different for the later Spitfires, so don't just rely on that. Double check everything. Okay. You know what, while we're in here, we'll double check the other torques. You don't have to take anything apart to check that. Next thing you want to do is get your gauge back on, take a reading before you put everything else back together. Push the crank forward, zero the gauge, push it back, and that's 8 thousandths, which is a little on the large side, but if we put in a 5 over thrust washer, then we're going to end up at 3 thousandths, and that's not good. But anyway, we're within spec. It's less than 11. That's what we want. There's a lot of people that will say, correctly by the way, that you really shouldn't need a gasket sealant on this. Let the gasket do its job. Which is great. I would say don't use silicone gasket sealant, because you're just going to end up, when you tighten everything down, you're going to squirt silicone into the engine and you're not going to be able to get it out. I mean, you can wipe it off the outside, but what are you going to do after the oil pan's on? So a gasket sealant is fine, just make sure that you use it sparingly, not like that right there. Because however much you use, after you tighten it down, you don't want it squirting out. You just want just enough to keep it in place and not leaking. A little bit is great, a lot of it will definitely cause problems. Of course, I've already done the gasket sealant on the pan as well. You want to let it get tacky, make sure that your bolt holes all line up. bolts through my ultrasonic cleaner. Yes, technically I put the spring washers through it too, but there's no need to do that because I'm of course going to replace those all. That's it. Go back and torque your bolts.
And there you have it. We are done. So that's how to adjust the crankshaft end float. Normally you do that in the course of an engine rebuild. We're not doing a full rebuild on this, mostly because the engine's going to come back out when the car goes into a restoration anyway, which isn't happening right at this moment. There's too many other projects. So keep an eye out though. We will pull it apart, but that's the engine back in good enough shape. The compression tested out good when we checked that, so we're good to go. If you've got any questions, please post in the comments below, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help. We appreciate it. Thanks very much, and we'll see you next time.